Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. I'm at 3 Onslow Gardens, London. You see that black door behind me and the grey hoardings are doing some renovation. This is the childhood home of Jeremy Thorpe. So he was born in 1929. His father was a Conservative Member of Parliament. His maternal grandfather, Empire Jack Hayward, had also been a Conservative Member of Parliament. So Thorpe's father was born at Cork in Ireland and had qualified as a barrister, practiced in Manchester, been in the Manchester Regiment in the First World War, had a good war, and as I say, got into politics. So, Thorpe's mother was from a wealthy family. His maternal grandfather had made a fortune in engineering, but things had gone wrong from the 1920s, taking on a project in Egypt, but hugely underestimated his costs and about to be ruined and had committed suicide. It was a theme that was to continue in Thorpe's life. His sister also committed suicide much later, and Thorpe himself contemplated it in the late 70s, but decided there'd been too much of that in the family and he was not going to commit this ultimate act of self-destruction. But there was a bit of a self-destruct aspect to this man. In case you didn't know, he was the leader of the Liberal Party, who's best known for the Norman Scott affair. You may have seen a very English scandal, came out a couple of years ago, with Hugh Grant playing Jeremy Thorpe. So Jeremy Thorpe was a bit of a gay Boris Johnson figure, forever flamboyant, life and soul of the party, absolute barrel of laughs, complete charlatan, completely untrustworthy, a showman, and someone who saw his party as little more than a juggernaut to advance his own ego. So Jeremy Thorpe, he went to prep school, he went on to Eton, although when the Second World War broke out, he and his sisters were evacuated to the United States. He went to private school there, was looked after by an affluent American family, and they supported, I think it was Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate in the 1940 election, whereas he sympathized more with the Democrats. So towards the end of the Second World War, he came back to the United Kingdom and he went to Eton. He was only at Eton for about 2.5 years. So, there is when he is alleged to have first experimented with homosexuality. It was quite common at the time, but these days enough biological drama keeps most of the boys on the straight and narrow. Now, although a lot of boys experimented with gay relationships at Eton in those days, with boys their own age, most of them grew out of that. And by the 20s, almost all of them were straight. It was just something a phase they'd gone through during their adolescence when they had no access to girls. So his father died when he was a teenager. He left Eton and then he worked at a prep school for a term. In those days, that was quite common to be even 17 and to be allowed to teach at a prep school. We were not really into qualifications. Very few people completed school in those days. Few people stayed to school until the age of 18. Only about 2% of the population went to university. So then there was national services and compulsory military service. And so he survived basic training. He was sent to Portadown in Northern Ireland for this non-commissioned officers course. He had petit mal epilepsy, something that Freud associated with same-sex attraction. And whilst in County Armagh, he staged this blackout, supposedly a severe attack, and had himself invalided out and judged to be permanently medically unfit for wearing the King's uniform. Some say he even staged bedwetting. So he was delighted he got to go to Oxford, Trinity College early to read law, because his father had been a barrister. Anyway, so he was a good friend of George Carman, who was later a most distinguished QC, but he wasn't a fantastic law student, Jeremy Thorpe. You can't be brilliant at everything. But he got involved in the Oxford Union Society. He was always a Liberal, which is a highly eccentric position at the time. Bearing in mind, 1945 election, the Liberals had been reduced to only 12 seats. There was another influence in all this. His family was a close friend of David Lloyd George, the last Liberal Prime Minister who'd served from 1916 to 22. And indeed, Thorpe regarded him as a grandfather figure. You ought to read that magisterial biography of Thorpe by Michael Block, in which said he was interviewing Thorpe in the early 90s and asked a question about your grandfather, and Thorpe simply assumed this is an allusion to David Lloyd George. So Lloyd George was a titanic figure in the first third of the 20th century in British politics, and even in the late 30s people thought that he might come back as Prime Minister. He died in 1945, so he was a seminal influence on Thorpe's life. So he went into Liberal politics, They only had a dozen seats out of 650, and that was that. He was elected president of the Oxford Union, but he didn't have a great deal of time for studying jurisprudence. So he used to help George Carman prepare for his speech at the Oxford Union, and Carman would help him write his law essays. So Thorpe scraped a third-class degree. Now, these days, if you had a third in law or any subject and you wish to become a barrister, you'd be given short shrift. You must have a 2-2. I'm not saying it's difficult without a 2-2, I'm saying it's absolutely impossible. That is an iron rule. Even with a 2-2, you could more or less forget it. But times were different, and barristers were almost always upper middle class white boys from the home counties. Well, Thorpe was no exception, so he was indeed called to the bar. He got pupillage. You'd have not a snowball and a hell's chance of that these days if you had anything less than a 2-1. And there he was. He began his desultory practice, not really committed to the law. He was a very forward person. He was perennially chatty and of a very sunny disposition. So he went into liberal politics and a search for a seat in the West Country. Now, southwestern England was the only area of the realm in which the Liberals might have been growing. And he managed to have him selected for Devon North, and he stood twice. In 1959, he pulled off a minor miracle by being elected to Parliament, and there are only half a dozen Liberal MPs. The party was hovering somewhere between existence and non-existence, who was only contesting half the seats in the UK, and the party was very much cash-strapped. So he was a parliamentary wit, very well known for his one-liners. There was the night of the long lives when I think it was Harold Macmillan sacked half his cabinet, and Thorpe said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his friends for his life." So it proved. All right, so then the old leader Joe Grimmond, also educated at Eton and Oxford, was about to stand aside. So in 1967, Thorpe managed to have himself elected a leader of the Liberal Party, that tiny band. Before long, they were doing quite well in the polls. But he was then coming up for 40, and questions were asked about his private life. So remember, homosexual acts were illegal until 1967. He'd voted for the decriminalisation of these acts. But he'd had a number of boyfriends, but no lasting relationship. Then he married a young woman, Miss Allpass, and that was that. A rather lanky woman who was very outgoing, not particularly committed to liberalism or didn't care that much about politics, and soon they were blessed with a bonny baby boy. I don't think he entirely put aside his homosexual inclinations, but he came to genuinely love his wife. I don't think anyone doubts that. And then she was killed in a car crash just after the 1970 election. And another problem befell him is in the early 60s, he'd had a liaison with an ostler named Norman Josiffe, who later changed his surname to Norman Scott. He was born in London, half Irish, half English, son of an accountant, but didn't pursue higher education himself. And Thorpe had tried to help him out, getting him various jobs abroad. He'd had a brief liaison with him and wanted rid of him. But Josiffe was always saying that Thorpe had his national insurance card and just would go away and always screw things up, was a practiced teller of hard luck stories, and was starting to haunt Thorpe more or less, writing and begging letters. Thorpe then thought it wise not to write him directly, so John Jeremy Thorpe would get other people to write to him. But they had some sort of romantic liaison. There seemed to be some genuine feeling for a few months anyway, because in 1963 there was the infamous Bunny's letter saying, "Dear Norman, I read your letter over breakfast. It gave me the most tremendous pleasure," and eventually writing, "P.S. Bunnies can and will go to France." So bunnies, why on earth would you write that to another man if you're straight? The other thing is Thorpe accidentally dated it 1963. It was February. 1962. It was 63 he wrote it, as in it was the day after Joseph's 21st birthday, giving the very strong impression they'd begun a sexual relationship when Josiffe was 20. Now, homosexual acts at all ages were illegal back then, but it was a man over 21 who had congress with a man under 21. The older party was severely punished for supposedly having corrupted the younger man. Josiffe did nothing to correct that misapprehension. A bit into a new year, you might accidentally write the last year. I do this kind of thing. I get numbers muddled up all the time, as you will have noticed. And then it was illegal. Josiffe was going to the police, telling people about it, and he's a problem just refused to go away. Thorpe tried paying him off, getting him jobs abroad, but it never seemed to work. So he was somewhat mentally ill. Norman Josiffe had spent some time in psychiatric institutions. He's still alive, by the way. You can find him on Facebook, Norman Josiffe. Anyway, the next thing is Thorpe supposedly lost his cool, then decided he was going to have him assassinated. I don't know that to be true, but I strongly suspect it to be true. There's several people who testified to that in the 70s. And then Josiffe was in court over not paying his national insurance and blurted out, "I had a sexual affair with Jeremy Thorpe." And because it was said in court, journalists could report that safely without fear of being sued for libel. So that was that. The police had not investigated any allegations of sexual impropriety between the two males. But anyway, so in about 1975, Josiffe was going around all the pubs in North Devon, Thorpe's constituency, telling anyone who would lend an ear that he'd had this intimate liaison with Thorpe 10 years earlier. And a young man called Andrew Newton, he befriended Josiffe and invited him for a ride in the car. There'd been various attempts to lure him to places to bump him off, supposedly. And they went for a drive with a big Great Dane, Josiffe's Great Dane, saying, "Stop, get out of the car, we'll swap over, you drive." Okay. And when they get out of the car, then the Great Dane is shot dead, and the man points a gun at Josiffe and says, "You're next." But the gun jams and Josiffe runs off into the night, shrieking in terror and waving down a car. Sometime later, the would-be assassin drives off. But you're next. What does that mean? Does it mean I'm going to shoot you dead right now? Or does it mean if you're not silent, you will be killed? It's a warning. We're not going to kill you, we'll kill your dog to show we're serious. Not quite sure the long and the short of it, but the man who killed the dog was later convicted of possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. I don't think he was actually convicted of killing someone's dog, which is of course a crime. You're destroying someone's property, without the man's permission. And that was that. So the man went to prison, served his time, got out and got a bit of a payoff. Ideally, he was going to keep stum about it. But the police investigated this. Crucially, the dog had been shot dead in the neighbouring county, not in North Devon. The Devonshire Constabulary might have handled it more favourably towards Thorpe, this being an era when the police tended to kowtow to the upper orders, particularly members of Parliament. That's why people like that Liberal MP, Sir Cyril Smith, got away with things. But anyway, Thorpe was investigated by the police. He was arrested. He'd agreed to resign if he was ever arrested because the Liberal Chief Whip, David Steele, was hearing about it. And Thorpe denied ever having any sexual relationship with the man. There was also a matter of a donation of £10,000 from Jack Hayward, this British businessman in the Bahamas known as Union Jack. And the Liberal Party was very short of funds, so this was manna from heaven for such a tiny political party, which was almost bankrupt half the time. What had he done with the money? He'd routed it via this Pakistani Parsi businessman, a chum of his, resident in Jersey, and into Thorpe's personal account, and it hadn't found its way into the coffers of the Liberal Party. He'd used it to pay off the hitman, is the answer. And Thorpe gave 3 completely contradictory accounts of what he did with the money. He obviously didn't say, I used it to pay a hitman. So Thorpe was charged with murder. The 1979 election was coming up. It was going down very badly on the doorstep. Okay, there was just even the gay aspect was enough. Yes, homosexuality was lawful, but it was very much disapproved of, and it would have a terminal effect on most people's careers in those days. No MPs had come out as gay. Someone had been exposed as gay by this stage. And the idea that a leader of a political party might have ordered an assassination of someone for saying something embarrassing was obviously scandalous. But anyway, Thorpe insisted he would contest Devon North. The Conservatives were his main challengers then. He'd taken it off the Tories some time earlier. And he managed to have the date of his trial delayed so he could contest his constituency, and he was defeated. He'd expected that, but what he hadn't expected was the Tories to defeat him by a thumping majority. So went to trial at the Old Bailey. He had a few co-defendants, and they chose not to testify in their defence. You have the right not to speak, but if you can't be cross-examined by the prosecution, then you can't be cross-examined by your own barrister either. But anyway, George Carman, his old university friend, contacted him, and he conducted his defence, insisted on doing it alone. Yes, Thorpe was a barrister, but he hadn't practised for almost 20 years. And Carman said, I'm going to run this show alone. I know how to do it. And I know you think that, this is going to be the greatest show on earth. This is your chance to speak from the stage. But no, you will remain stony silent, and then I'll get you off the hook. You could talk your way into a life sentence because he's rather too loquacious. But it worked anyway. Carman tore to shreds the credibility of his opponents, and the judge, Justice Cantley, was extraordinarily prejudiced towards Thorpe, and was perhaps tugging the forelock to the establishment and suggesting that, what's his name, Norman Josiffe, or Norman Scott, perhaps I should call him, was a gutter snipe, and he was utterly unworthy of belief and all the rest of it. So it was a failure of proof defence, and they were all acquitted after one weekend for the jury to deliberate. That was it. He was a free man, but his political career was over, and he was briefly president of Amnesty International. Well, he had every good reason to be grateful for the presumption of innocence, but there was a letter-writing campaign, sacks of wrathful mail to Amnesty, and he was pressurised into standing down. He was never involved in politics again, apart from being president of his local association. So he remained, well, laconic on political matters. David Steele, who was leader of the Liberal Party, really wanted to move the discourse on this, from this endless discussion of Thorpe's private life and onto areas which looked better for the Liberal Party. You know, it was very inconvenient for him that people, when they heard Liberal, would only ever talk about Jeremy Thorpe. You know, the Liberals got 19% of the vote in 1974. By 79, they were under half that. So it was a breakthrough hadn't materialised. Thorpe was ever optimistic, a bit of a fantasist, thinking he was going to get over 120 seats in the 1974 election. Other thing about him, well, he was an ardent Europhile. He was against apartheid, things like that. He felt distaste for Ulster Unionism, despite being, you know, Irish Protestant on his father's side, and his grandfather being very keen on the unity of the UK and things like that. So it was not an easy man to know. What was the personality behind all this? In the early 70s, he'd married Marion Stein, who'd come to this country as a teenage Jewish refugee from Vienna. She'd later married the Earl of Harewood and the Queen's cousin, had 3 sons with him, but got divorced due to her husband's infidelities. So they had a very happy marriage as well. This woman just slightly older than him, but they had no children together. So that was Thorpe. He kept fairly low profile. To think I walked past his house countless times, not realising where it was. Not this one. He moved out of here when he was little. The one at Orme Court. I wish I'd met him, but from the early 80s, he was suffering motor neurone disease. So only died in 2014, and that's why people could say whatever they wanted then, without fear of being sued for libel or indeed slander. So that's Jeremy Thorpe, an absolutely scintillating figure, someone I wish I'd met in his heyday. He might have become part of the government if the 1974 negotiations between the Conservatives and Liberals had actually led to a coalition. He wanted a referendum on proportional representation. Edward Heath, the Conservative leader, couldn't commit to one. Both had to consult their cabinet, and people said, we want to get the Tories out, we don't want to be tired of their unpopularity, saying that in the Liberals, and the Conservatives were deeply sceptical about any pact with the Liberals. Situations have played out again in 2010, when Nick Clegg came in to be Deputy Prime Minister. Well, that is Jeremy Thorpe. He was a liar to the last. There was a Thorpe who was Speaker of the House of Commons. There's no evidence that he was related to that Thorpe. It's a Norse surname, like as in the Oslo airport Thorpe, and there are various places with that in the surname, in the name. Sorry, toponyms like Thorpe Lesoken. It's more associated with the Danelaw, the surname Thorpe, and his family came from a completely different part of the country, from the Peer of the Realm. So he bogusly claimed that he was a descendant of the Peer of the Realm. Even on the order of service for his funeral, they had this coat of arms for that Peer of the Realm. But so again, that was a whimsy. Well, that's enough about Jeremy Thorpe. Please keep the donations coming so I can maintain this channel. And please book me for online lessons. Choose me as your tour guide in London. Support me on Patreon and PayPal. Goodbye.